Mark Reynolds had seen his fair share of corruption, crime, and deception in his years as chief of police. But when he moved into the Oak Ridge Estates, a pristine, high-end neighborhood known for its luxury and order, he thought he was finally stepping into a peaceful chapter of his life. The streets were lined with elegant houses, manicured lawns, and a quiet serenity that seemed too good to be true. At first, everything felt perfect. Neighbors smiled politely, the community was well maintained, and the Homeowners Association, HOA, ensured that every house adhered to strict standards. Mark had dealt with HOAs before, but this one seemed unusually intense. The rules were rigid, the fines severe, and the board members carried themselves with an air of unquestionable authority. Then, the first complaint arrived. A neatly typed notice in his mailbox informed him that his trash cans were placed 2 inches too far from the curb. A minor issue, Mark thought. He adjusted them and moved on. But within days, another notice followed, this time about the color of his mailbox, which apparently violated an aesthetic uniformity clause. It was odd. His mailbox was identical to his neighbor's, and yet the fines kept coming. The grass was too long by half an inch, his porch light was too bright, and his police-issued SUV was deemed an unauthorized vehicle for street parking. Mark started to notice something unsettling. Not everyone was being targeted. His neighbor, a retired businessman, had an overgrown yard, yet no violations were posted on his door. Another resident blatantly ignored the trash bin rule, yet no fines appeared in his mailbox. Why was Mark being singled out? One evening, as he stood in his driveway reading yet another warning notice, an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Carter, walked by. She hesitated, glanced around as if making sure no one was watching, then whispered, "They're testing you. The HOA doesn't like newcomers, especially those they can't control." Mark raised an eyebrow. Could it really be that simple? Or was there something more sinister at play? Hey, real quick! If you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. Mark Reynolds wasn't the kind of man to pick unnecessary fights. As chief of police, he had spent years de-escalating conflicts, not creating them. But something about the way the Homeowners Association operated didn't sit right with him. The notices kept piling up, one after another. His grass was too long, by half an inch. His mailbox was the wrong shade of black, even though it was the same as his neighbor's. His porch light was too bright, despite being an energy-efficient model approved by the city. It wasn't just annoying, it was targeted. Mark played along at first, making the adjustments, keeping his head down. But the more he complied, the more the HOA pushed. Then came the fine for his patrol SUV, the one he parked in his own driveway. Unauthorized commercial vehicle, ashed, the notice read, printed in bold red letters. That was the last straw. One afternoon, Mark walked over to the HOA office, a sleek, overly polished building at the edge of the neighborhood. The air-conditioned lobby smelled of expensive cologne and paperwork. At the desk sat Richard Coleman, HOA president, a man in his late 50s dressed like a corporate executive, with slicked-back gray hair and a smug confidence that reeked of unchecked power. Mark placed the notice on the desk, his voice calm but firm. "Explain this." Coleman barely glanced at it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. "It's a violation, Chief Reynolds. HOA guidelines prohibit commercial vehicles from being parked overnight." Mark raised an eyebrow. "A police vehicle is not a commercial truck," Coleman smirked. "Rules are rules." Mark clenched his jaw. "You selectively enforce them." He glanced at a security monitor behind Coleman's desk. Several HOA board members' driveways were visible. At least 2 had service trucks. parked outside. No notices. No fines. Coleman followed his gaze and chuckled. "You're new here, Mark. Let me give you some advice. Don't make this difficult for yourself." A slow realization crept over Mark. This wasn't just about rules. This was about power. And Coleman wasn't used to being challenged. As Mark turned to leave, a voice stopped him. "Be careful," someone murmured. He turned to see Mrs. Carter, the elderly neighbor who had warned him before. She stood near the entrance, her expression tense. "They don't like people who push back," she whispered. Mark nodded but didn't reply, because now he wasn't just suspicious. He was certain. Something was seriously wrong with this HOA. The next morning, Mark found 3 new violation notices taped to his front door. One for having his trash cans out for more than 2 hours, another for a non-uniform flower bed, and the last, this one almost laughable, for failure to maintain a visually cohesive driveway. The total fines? Over $1,000, Mark exhaled sharply, gripping the papers. This wasn't just nitpicking anymore. This was targeted harassment. As he walked his property, he noticed something else. He wasn't the only one suffering. Several houses down, a family loaded furniture into a moving truck. A foreclosure notice was posted on their door. Mark had spoken to them once, a middle-class couple with 2 kids. They had mentioned financial troubles after repeated HOA fines. He knocked on their door. The husband, John Miller, hesitated before opening it. His face was pale, his eyes sunken. "Mark," he sighed, "I appreciate you stopping by, but it's too late." Mark glanced at the notice. "They fined you into foreclosure?" John nodded, his hands clenched. "We fought it, but the HOA has a lawyer on retainer. We didn't stand a chance." Mark frowned. "Did you ever see where all that fine money went?" John's gaze flickered to the side before he shook his head. "Nobody asks. If you push back, they make your life hell." Mark left without another word. But now, his instincts were screaming. Something was deeply wrong with this HOA. That night, Mark took a walk around the neighborhood, paying attention to details he had overlooked before. He spotted at least 3 homes violating HOA rules: an RV parked in one driveway, a yard with knee-high grass, a front porch cluttered with mismatched decorations. Yet, no fines on their doors. What did these homes have in common? Then it hit him. Every one of them belonged to an HOA board member. The next HOA meeting was set in the neighborhood clubhouse, a gated private facility that only board members seemed to use. Mark had never stepped inside before. When he walked in, the first thing he noticed was the sheer extravagance: luxury leather chairs, a fully stocked bar, and a chandelier that looked like it belonged in a 5-star hotel. He watched as Richard Coleman laughed with other board members, swirling a glass of whiskey. They weren't just running a neighborhood, they were living off it. Mark clenched his jaw. He had seen corruption in law enforcement, in politics. But this was predatory greed disguised as community service. And now he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about HOA rules, it was about power, money, and a system designed to keep people afraid. But they had underestimated one thing. Mark Reynolds wasn't afraid. Mark Reynolds had spent years taking down criminals who thought they were untouchable. Drug lords, corrupt officials, organized crime rings. He had seen it all. But now, staring at the stack of HOA violation notices on his kitchen table, he realized something. This wasn't just about ridiculous rules or petty fines. This was a racket, and it was time to take it down. Mark started where any investigator would: the paper trail. Most HOAs were legally required to keep records of their expenses, budgets, and income. But Oak Ridge Estates? Their financials were practically locked away. The HOA's website had a budget summary, but it was vague, listing only maintenance fees, community improvements, and administrative costs. No detailed breakdown, no vendor contracts, Nothing. So Mark dug deeper. Through public records requests, he found something disturbing. HOA dues had doubled over the past 5 years, yet there were no major improvements in the community. The streets weren't repaved, the clubhouse was the same, and the security cameras hadn't been updated in a decade. Where was all the money going? Then, late one night, Mark received a knock on his back door. He opened it to find John Miller, the neighbor who had been forced into foreclosure. His hands were shaking as he pulled out a folder from under his jacket. "I worked in finance," John whispered. "Before they forced me out, I got access to some documents. You need to see this." Inside the folder were bank statements, invoices, and wire transfers. Mark's eyes scanned the documents, his stomach tightening. Millions of dollars in HOA fees were being funneled into a private account, an account controlled by none other than Richard Coleman and the other board members. Payments labeled as landscaping expenses were actually going to a shell company, one that didn't exist beyond a P.O. box. Community improvement funds? They were being withdrawn as consulting fees and funneled into personal accounts. And the worst part? The board had the power to seize homes through foreclosure when residents couldn't pay their fines, then resell them at a profit. That's why John Miller and others had been forced out. Mark's jaw tightened. They weren't just running a corrupt HOA. They were running a financial scam, weaponizing the rules to steal from the very people they were supposed to serve. Mark knew he couldn't confront Coleman directly. Not yet. The HOA had lawyers, influence, and the ability to make people disappear through endless bureaucracy. If he wanted to bring them down, he needed undeniable proof. So he did what he did best. He set a trap. That night, he gathered the residents he trusted: John Miller, Mrs. Carter, and a few others who had been victimized. They exchanged stories, compared documents, and pieced together the full extent of the corruption. And then, with the precision of a seasoned investigator, Mark devised a plan. Because if Coleman and his cronies thought they were untouchable, they were about to learn the hard way that they had messed with the wrong man. Mark Reynolds had spent his career taking down criminals who thought they were untouchable. But this time, the enemy wasn't a drug kingpin or a mob boss. It was a corrupt HOA hiding behind paperwork, bylaws, and intimidation. And tonight, he was about to catch them red-handed. Through a trusted HOA insider, Mark learned that Coleman and his board were holding an emergency meeting at the private clubhouse. The topic: financial restructuring, a phrase that, given what Mark already knew, likely meant covering their tracks. But Mark wasn't going in blind. Before heading out, he wired himself up with a hidden recording device, a piece of tech he had used countless times in police investigations. A pin-sized microphone, small enough to avoid suspicion, but powerful enough to capture every whispered word. His plan was simple: get in, get proof, get out. When Mark arrived at the clubhouse, the doors were already closed. Through a side window, he could see Coleman and the other board members gathered around a long table, glasses of expensive liquor in hand. He slipped in quietly, staying in the shadows. A back hallway led to an air vent, a perfect acoustic amplifier. He crouched down, pressed his phone against the vent's opening, and hit record. Then he listened. Coleman's voice was the first to cut through the air. "We have a problem. Reynolds isn't backing down." A murmur of agreement followed. Another board member, a man in his 60s with a gold watch flashing under the dim light, scoffed. "So what? We've handled nosy residents before. Fine him until he gives up." Coleman exhaled sharply. "It's different this time. He's not just another homeowner. He's the chief of police." Silence. Then another voice. "We could offer him a deal," Coleman scoffed. "You think a guy like him can be bought?" "No. If he keeps pushing, we have to get rid of him." Mark's jaw tightened. He had expected corruption, but not outright. Threats? Then came the real bombshell. One of the board members, an older woman with a sharp, calculating voice, spoke up. "We've already made over $2 million from foreclosures alone. If he digs too deep, he'll find the offshore accounts." Mark's heartbeat slowed. Offshore accounts. That was the smoking gun. Not only were they running an illegal fine racket, but they were laundering the money out of the country. Mark had heard enough. He carefully backed away from the vent, his phone still recording every word. But as he turned to leave, he froze. Richard Coleman stood at the end of the hallway. For the first time, the confident, smug HOA president looked genuinely rattled. His eyes flicked to Mark's hands, as if already guessing what he was holding. "You shouldn't be here, Chief." Coleman's voice was low, dangerous. Mark kept his posture relaxed, but his hand was already near his concealed firearm. "Funny," Mark said coolly. "I was just about to say the same to you." Coleman took a step forward. "You have no idea who you're messing with." Mark smirked. "And you have no idea who I am." Then, without another word, he walked past Coleman, recording still rolling. Because now it wasn't just about exposing them. It was about bringing them down. Mark Reynolds had spent years dealing with criminals, men who operated in the shadows, who used fear and intimidation to get their way. But now, he was facing something even more insidious. A group of corrupt HOA officials who had turned a quiet suburban neighborhood into their personal empire. And after last night's secret recording, they knew he was coming for them. The first sign of retaliation came the next morning. Mark opened his mailbox to find 6 new violation notices: unauthorized modifications to property, failure to maintain an aesthetically pleasing exterior, excessive noise complaints, and, the most absurd one, hosting unapproved gatherings. Mark shook his head, gripping the papers tightly. The unapproved gathering was just him talking to neighbors on his porch. But that was just the beginning. That night, his security cameras caught something disturbing. 2 men, faces hidden under hoodies, creeping through his yard. They slashed his car tires and spray-painted rule breaker on his garage door. Mark watched the footage, his jaw tightening. This wasn't about fines anymore. This was a warning. But they had made a critical mistake, because Mark Reynolds didn't scare easily. The next attack wasn't against his home. It was against his career. Mark was halfway through his morning coffee when his phone rang. It was the mayor's office. "Chief Reynolds, we've received a troubling report from your HOA." Mark sat up, his grip tightening on the phone. "What kind of report?" The official hesitated. "It alleges misconduct, claims of abusing authority and creating an unsafe environment for the neighborhood." Mark exhaled slowly. "And you believe them?" "Of course not." The voice on the other end softened. "But you know how these things go. A formal complaint means we have to launch an internal review. It's not a good look." Mark clenched his jaw. The HOA wasn't just trying to fine him into submission. They were trying to take his badge. That evening, the HOA board called for an emergency neighborhood meeting. Mark knew what it was. They were making their final move. The clubhouse was packed when he arrived. Richard Coleman sat at the front, flanked by his board members. A projector screen displayed a list of Mark's alleged violations. Coleman cleared his throat, voice dripping with faux concern. "As you all know, our HOA exists to protect this community." He glanced at Mark. "But some residents believe they are above the rules." A few murmurs from the crowd. Mark could feel the tension in the air. Coleman leaned forward. "Chief Reynolds has failed to comply with HOA regulations. Time and time again. As per our bylaws, we have the authority to revoke his residency." Mark crossed his arms. "You're trying to evict me?" Coleman smirked. "We're enforcing the rules." Mark let out a slow breath. Enough. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. "Before you do that, let's hear what you really think about rules." Then he hit play. Coleman's voice filled the room. "We've already made over $2 million from foreclosures alone. If he digs too deep, he'll find the offshore accounts." The room went silent. Then gasps. Neighbors turned to each other in shock. Some pulled out their phones, recording the moment. Coleman's face drained of color. "Turn that off." Mark took a step forward. "You used HOA fines to steal from your own neighbors. You targeted families, forced them out of their homes, and laundered the money." Coleman's hand shook as he pointed at Mark. "That recording is illegal," Mark smirked. "No, it's not. And guess what?" He pulled out a flash drive. "It's already been sent to the state attorney's office." Coleman's mouth opened, then closed, because in that moment, he knew. It was over. Richard Coleman had always believed he was untouchable. For years, he and his corrupt HOA board had ruled the neighborhood through intimidation, selective enforcement, and outright theft. But today, that reign was coming to an end. The HOA clubhouse was packed. A final hearing had been called, a desperate attempt by Coleman and his board to contain the damage. The tension in the air was thick, neighbors whispering, phones out, ready to record. Coleman sat at the head of the table trying to maintain his usual smug demeanor, but his fingers tapped against the wood. A nervous tick. Then the doors swung, open. Mark Reynolds walked in full uniform. Gasps rippled through the room. People had always known Mark was a cop, but seeing him in his official capacity? That changed everything. And then right behind him, a team of state investigators and financial auditors walked in. The murmur turned into outright chaos. Coleman's face went pale. Mark stepped forward, pulling out a thick folder. His voice was calm, but the authority in it was undeniable. "I've spent the last month gathering evidence. Every fraudulent fine, every intimidation tactic, every misused dollar." He set the folder on the table with a heavy thud. "You've been running an illegal racket, Richard. And now?" Mark gestured to the investigators behind him. "The state is here to clean house." One of the officials, a sharp-looking woman in a gray suit, opened her own file. "Mr. Coleman, we have evidence of financial misconduct, fraud, and harassment. You and several board members are under investigation." Coleman shot to his feet. "This is outrageous. You can't—" "Actually," Mark cut in, "we can." And then, with perfect timing, one of the auditors spoke up. "We've frozen your HOA accounts." Coleman staggered back. "What?" the official continued, flipping through a document. "The funds from excessive fines? The money funneled into private accounts? It's all being traced." Another investigator stepped forward. "Mr. Coleman, you need to come with us." For the first time, Coleman looked truly terrified. As the investigators moved in, one of the board members bolted for the exit, but Mark was faster. "Sit down." His voice carried a weight that stopped the man in his tracks. The board member hesitated, then slowly sank back into his chair, defeated. Coleman was still frozen, eyes darting between Mark and the investigators. He had spent years abusing power. Now, it was finally being used against him. Click. The sound of handcuffs snapping shut was music to Mark's ears. Coleman barely managed to whisper, "You set me up." Mark leaned in, a smirk tugging at his lips. "No, Richard, you set yourself up." As Coleman and several board members were led away, the room erupted. Neighbors cheered. Some shook Mark's hand. Others just stood in stunned silence, processing what had just happened. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was finally free. And Mark, he just tipped his hat and walked out the door. Because his job here was done. The neighborhood had always been beautiful. Perfect lawns, clean streets, elegant homes. But for years it had been a prison, a place where fear ruled, where a handful of corrupt men had turned a homeowners association into a personal empire. But now, that empire had fallen. The very next morning, a notice went out to every resident. Effective immediately, the current HOA board is dissolved. All pending fines, fees, and violations are null and void. An independent review will determine how stolen funds are repaid to homeowners. The reaction was instant. Neighbors celebrated. People who had once whispered in fear now laughed openly. In the streets, families who had been bullied into silence spoke freely. Mark watched from his porch as a group of kids rode their bikes past a house that had once been targeted for excessive noise. A woman planted flowers in her front yard without fear of getting a fine for unapproved landscaping. For the first time in years, the neighborhood belonged to the people again. Across town, Richard Coleman sat in a cold, gray interrogation room. No board members to back him up. No fake fines to throw around, just him, a lawyer, and a mountain of evidence. The charges were severe: fraud, embezzlement, harassment, and more. The HOA's illegal scheme had bled homeowners for millions, and now he was looking at years behind bars. Mark never set out to be a hero. He had just wanted a quiet home, a place to relax after long days protecting and serving the city. But when the HOA tried to push him around, they had underestimated who they were dealing with. Now, as he walked through the neighborhood, people waved, shook his hand, and thanked him. Even those who had once feared speaking out now stood tall. Because one person's courage had reminded them all of something important. That bullies only win when good people stay silent. That night, Mark sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. He sipped his coffee, a rare moment of peace settling in. The fight was over. Justice had been served. But as he looked around at his now free neighborhood, he knew one thing for sure. He would never let fear rule this place again. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.